human carried an alien girl past the Ember Ridge. Her final gesture held a calm kind of honor. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. The sun was setting over Ember Ridge, casting an eerie orange glow over the jagged peaks and winding paths. The air was thick with the scent of burning embers, the land scorched by ancient flames that had once ravaged this unforgiving terrain. The sound of the wind howled, carrying with it the bitter taste of smoke. It was a place where survival was uncertain, where even the strongest were tested by the relentless elements. And yet, in the heart of this desolate place, Jake Carter found himself carrying a burden far heavier than any physical weight. His muscles ached as he trudged through the rocky path, each step slow and labored, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Lyra, the alien girl, had collapsed moments ago, her frail body too weak to carry on. He had no idea what kind of creature she was. Her blue-green skin, the shimmering silver strands of hair, and her large, striking eyes had all been foreign to him. Yet none of that mattered now. What mattered was that she needed him, and Jake had promised to see her through this journey. The Ember Ridge was a place feared by all who lived nearby, an inhospitable wasteland where only the most hardened adventurers dared to tread. The treacherous terrain was filled with sharp cliffs, scorching winds, and the ever-present threat of collapsing rocks. Despite his exhaustion, Jake pressed on, his determination unshaken. Lyra's breathing was shallow against his chest, her body wrapped in his arms as he carried her through the roughest part of the ridge. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, her gaze locking with his. There was no fear in her expression, only a quiet acceptance, as if she knew her fate was in his hands. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a mere breath against the wind. Jake didn't reply at first. There was no need for words. He only nodded, his jaw set in determination. But as they continued their journey, something shifted in him. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about survival anymore. There was something more at stake, something deeper than he could explain. The ridge seemed endless, but the promise of safety at the far end kept him going, each step a testament to his commitment. Despite the danger, despite his weariness, he had no intention of giving up. Not now. Not while Lyra still needed him. As they reached the final stretch of the ridge, a moment of quiet settled between them. The last stretch was the hardest, the ground more unstable, the air thinner. But they had made it this far. Jake knew it wouldn't be long before they would reach safety. Lyra stirred again, this time with more clarity in her eyes. She raised a hand, gently touching his face. There was a calm, almost regal air about her, something that Jake hadn't noticed before. She was no longer the broken creature he had found in the wilderness. In that moment, Jake understood that this journey had been more than a simple rescue. It had been a meeting of two souls from different worlds, bound together by a shared need for survival. Lyra's fingers brushed his cheek one last time, and then, as if giving him a silent blessing, she closed her eyes and leaned back into his arms. Jake's heart clenched, but he didn't stop. Her final gesture was one of quiet honor, a calm acceptance of their shared fate. As the ridge finally gave way to the gentle slopes of the valley beyond, Jake couldn't help but feel a profound sense of respect. They had made it. Together. The wind howled through the valley, the gentle slopes of Ember Ridge now stretching behind them. Jake's legs were heavy, each step sinking deeper into the soft earth, but he didn't stop. Not yet. The promise of safety just ahead kept him moving, the cool evening air offering a sense of relief that, in the midst of exhaustion, felt like salvation. Lyra's breathing had steadied, though she remained unconscious, her fragile form draped across his chest. The quiet between them felt profound, as if the world had paused, allowing them this brief moment of calm after the storm of their journey. He glanced down at her, her alien features still so strange yet comforting in their own way. Her skin, like polished turquoise, shimmered faintly in the light of the setting sun. He had no idea where she came from or what her people were like. But it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that he had kept his promise. He had carried her past Ember Ridge. The path ahead now seemed almost too peaceful after the dangers they had just left behind. Trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches casting long, delicate shadows on the ground. The landscape before them opened up, revealing a lush valley. Jake's steps quickened, not out of urgency, but because he felt the weight of his promise lifting. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, but the exhaustion from the journey had dulled the sharp edges of his thoughts. His focus was singular: get to safety and keep Lyra safe. He couldn't help but wonder what she would do once they reached the end of their journey. Would she stay with him? Or was their time together limited to this singular act of survival? The questions lingered in the back of his mind, unanswered and unwelcome, as they trudged on. After what seemed like an eternity, Jake finally spotted a small, remote cabin nestled between the trees. It was modest, but it looked sturdy enough to provide shelter from the night. His heart lifted at the sight, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that, for once, the universe seemed to be on his side. He approached the cabin, carefully pushing open the door with his shoulder. The wooden door creaked, its hinges protesting after years of use. Inside, the space was simple but welcoming. A few pieces of furniture, a small fireplace, and a bed in the corner. It was a far cry from the harsh terrain of Ember Ridge, but it would do. He set Lyra gently on the bed, making sure she was comfortable before pulling a blanket over her. She stirred slightly, but didn't wake. Jake sat in a chair next to the bed, watching her sleep. The silence was heavy, but in a way, it was peaceful. He could hear the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth and the soft rustle of leaves outside the cabin. The storm had passed, but the night was still. He glanced over at Lyra, her face soft in sleep, and for a brief moment, he let himself imagine a life beyond the ridge, beyond the dangers they had faced. A life where he didn't have to be constantly on the move, always running, always fighting. A life where he could find peace. But for now, that was just a dream. The reality was that he was far from safe. They both were. They had made it through the worst of Ember Ridge, but the world beyond this cabin was full of dangers, and Jake knew it would only be a matter of time before they would face them again. But not tonight. Tonight, they could rest. As he sat in the dim light of the cabin, Jake found himself reflecting on the journey, on the strange bond he had formed with Lyra. She was no longer just a mysterious alien. She had become someone he felt responsible for, someone he had fought to protect. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt a sense of purpose beyond survival. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting to protect her. And that, he realized, was all that mattered. The fire in the cabin crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Jake sat in the chair next to the bed, his eyes never straying too far from Lyra. She had been sleeping soundly for hours now, but he knew they couldn't afford to relax for long. The world outside still carried dangers, and they both knew it. The storm had passed, but the path ahead would not be an easy one. As the night grew deeper, Jake found himself lost in thought. The events of the last few days seemed like a blur. From the moment he had found Lyra, lying alone and vulnerable in the wilderness, to now, with her resting peacefully in front of him, it felt like an entire lifetime had passed in a matter of days. He never expected this journey to change him in the ways it had. When he first found Lyra, he saw her as just another stranger in need of help. But now, as he watched her sleep, he realized how deeply he had come to care for her. There was something about her that felt different. She wasn't just a creature from another world. She had become someone he felt responsible for, someone whose survival depended on him. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake the thoughts from his mind. His life had always been about surviving, about making it through each day. But now it was different. Now, he had someone to protect. His heart stirred at the thought. He wasn't used to this feeling, this sense of connection, of responsibility. He had always been alone before, always keeping to himself, never allowing anyone to get too close. But Lyra was different. She wasn't like the others he had met in his travels. There was a calm strength about her, a quiet dignity that drew him in. She wasn't just another mission. She wasn't just another person to save. She had become something more. Jake glanced over at her, her serene face framed by the soft glow of the firelight. Her silver hair shimmered faintly, and her breathing was steady, almost peaceful. For a moment, it felt like the whole world had paused, as if everything had aligned perfectly in this small, quiet cabin. He smiled softly to himself, feeling a warmth spread through him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had a purpose beyond survival. Lyra stirred slightly, breaking his train of thought. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she seemed confused, disoriented. When she saw him sitting by her side, her expression softened, and she gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You're still here," she said, her voice hoarse but sincere. Jake nodded, his smile reassuring. "I told you I would stay. I'm not going anywhere." She closed her eyes again, but there was a peacefulness in her demeanor now that hadn't been there before. Jake watched her for a moment longer before standing up slowly, careful not to wake her. He moved over to the small window, pulling aside the curtain to look out into the night. The stars were bright in the clear sky, and the valley below stretched out peacefully, the dangers of the Ember Ridge now a distant memory. He couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. Would they be safe here, or would the world soon catch up to them? He didn't know, but for tonight, at least, they were safe. For tonight they had a chance to rest. He returned to the chair beside the bed and sat down once more, watching over Lyra as she slept. He had no idea what the future held for them, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. He had a purpose now, and that purpose was to protect her, no matter what came next. The morning light filtered gently through the small cabin window, casting soft shadows across the wooden floor. Jake awoke with a start, his body stiff from the uncomfortable chair where he had fallen asleep the night before. The warmth of the fire had long since faded, but the sense of peace that had settled in the cabin was still there. He stood up slowly, stretching his limbs and wincing as his muscles protested. Lyra was still asleep in the bed, her breathing steady and calm. Jake moved quietly around the cabin, careful not to wake her. He checked the small stove, adding a few more logs to the fire before making his way to the window. The sun had risen, and the valley outside was bathed in a soft, golden glow. The world beyond the cabin felt calm, almost serene, but Jake knew it wouldn't last long. They couldn't stay here forever. The dangers of the Ember Ridge were behind them, but there were still dangers in the world, and they were still very much in the unknown. As he stared out at the peaceful landscape, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. How long could they hide? How long before someone came looking for Lyra? He had no answers, only questions. But for now, they were safe. At least, for the moment. The sound of movement behind him caught his attention, and he turned to find Lyra stirring in the bed. She blinked slowly, her silver eyes meeting his with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice still hoarse from their journey. Jake smiled, trying to hide the concern he felt. "Morning. How are you feeling?" Lyra slowly pushed herself up, sitting against the pillows. Her movements were stiff, but there was a quiet strength in her demeanor that reminded Jake why he had been drawn to her in the first place. "I'm all right," she replied, her gaze drifting toward the window. "Where are we?" Jake walked over to the bed, sitting down next to her. He could tell that she was still processing everything that had happened. The journey, the danger, the strange human who had saved her life. "We're safe for now," he said, trying to reassure her. "This is a small cabin. We're far from Ember Ridge, but it's still not safe out there." Lyra nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice soft but sincere. "You didn't have to carry me. I could have." Jake shook his head, cutting her off. "You don't have to thank me. I made a promise." Lyra looked at him, her gaze lingering on his face. There was something in her eyes, something that made Jake feel like he had been seen, really seen, for the first time in a long time. It was as if she understood him in a way no one else ever had. He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how close they were. "We can't stay here forever," he said, his voice a little hoarser than he intended. "We'll need to move on soon." Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "I understand," she said, her voice steady. "I'll go wherever you need me to." Jake glanced at her, the sense of connection between them undeniable. There was no longer any hesitation in her tone. It wasn't just gratitude. It was trust. He felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time, he wasn't just taking care of her out of duty. There was something else now. Something deeper. "We'll figure it out," he said, his voice more confident than he felt. "But for now we rest. We recover." Lyra gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I can do that." Jake stood up, stretching once more as he moved to the small table in the corner of the cabin. He had no idea what lay ahead, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't alone. And that thought was enough to give him hope. He turned back to Lyra, who had settled back against the pillows, her eyes closing as she rested. "We'll get through this," Jake said softly to himself, more than to her. The future was uncertain, but in this small cabin, at least for today, they had peace. And sometimes, that was all you could ask for. The days following their arrival at the cabin passed quietly. The fire in the hearth crackled softly each night, filling the space with warmth and light. Jake spent his days repairing the cabin, making sure they had enough firewood and supplies to last. Lyra, though still recovering from their ordeal, slowly became more active. She would sit by the window, her eyes following the movement of birds and the distant hills, lost in thought. Jake had noticed her growing more thoughtful, more distant, and he could sense the weight of her past on her. She rarely spoke about where she came from or how she ended up in the wilderness, but Jake didn't push. He knew she would speak when she was ready. It was one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of red and purple, that Lyra finally spoke. Jake had just finished chopping some firewood when he heard her voice. "You know, I never expected to be here," she said, her tone thoughtful, almost wistful. Jake paused and looked over at her, but she was still gazing out the window. "What do you mean?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. Lyra turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze for the first time in what felt like days. "I never thought I would survive Ember Ridge. Or find someone like you," she said quietly. Jake felt a tightness in his chest at her words. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't used to people expressing such gratitude, and certainly not from someone like Lyra, whose strength had captivated him since the moment he met her. "I just did what anyone would do," he said, his voice gruff. Lyra shook her head, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "No, Jake. Not everyone would have done that. Not everyone would have risked their life for a stranger, especially someone like me." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Someone like you?" he repeated, confused. "You're not like us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're human, and I am different." Jake frowned, his brow furrowing. He knew Lyra was from another world, but he had never thought of her as different in a way that mattered. She was a person, just like him. "Lyra," he said softly, walking toward her, "I don't care where you're from or what you look like. What matters is who you are." Her eyes glistened with a strange intensity, and for a moment, Jake thought she might say something more, but she didn't. She simply nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I know," she said, her voice steady. "But there's still so much about me you don't know." Jake could see the hesitation in her eyes, the unspoken words hanging between them like a barrier neither of them could cross. "You don't have to tell me if you're not ready," Jake said, sitting down beside her. "I'm not going anywhere." Lyra turned her head to look at him, her eyes softening. "I know," she said again, and this time, there was a faint smile on her lips. It wasn't much, but to Jake, it meant everything. For the first time since they arrived, he felt like they were on the same page, like they were both ready to face whatever came next. The night deepened, and the soft sound of the wind outside was the only noise breaking the silence between them. As the firelight flickered in the small cabin, Jake felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone. He glanced over at Lyra, her form bathed in the warm glow of the fire, and realized that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The world outside was vast, filled with unknown dangers and untold secrets, but in this moment, in the quiet of the cabin, they had each other. And that was enough. The days passed slowly in the small cabin, the world outside still a distant, quiet reminder of the dangers that had once stalked them. Inside, Jake and Lyra settled into a routine, the hum of daily life filling the air as they worked together to keep the cabin functional. Jake had built a small fire pit outside, where he could cook, while Lyra focused on her recovery. Her strength was returning, but there was a quietness about her that Jake couldn't ignore. She spoke less often, spending more time by the window, watching the world beyond with a distant look in her eyes. Jake didn't push her to talk about her past. He knew it would come when she was ready. There was no need to force it. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Lyra was holding something back. Something important. One evening, As they sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows across the room, Jake finally decided to ask. "What happened to you, Lyra?" he asked gently, his voice low, almost hesitant. Lyra turned to look at him, her silver eyes soft but guarded. For a moment, she said nothing, and Jake thought he might have pushed too far. But then, she spoke, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I was part of a mission," she said quietly. "A mission to help my people, to find new worlds. But something went wrong. The mission failed, and I was left behind. Stranded." Her gaze drifted back to the window, the weight of her words hanging in the air between them. Jake felt a pang of sympathy, his heart aching for her. He had no idea what it must be like to be lost in such a vast, unknown world, cut off from everything you knew. "What happened after that?" Jake asked, his voice gentle. "How did you end up on Ember Ridge?" Lyra took a deep breath, her eyes closing briefly as if recalling a painful memory. "I was hunted," she said quietly. "There were others who didn't want me to survive. I had to fight to stay alive, to make sure no one would take me back to where I came from. It was easier to be alone than to trust anyone." Jake could hear the pain in her voice, the remnants of fear and distrust that still lingered in her words. He understood that. He had spent most of his life running from one danger or another, never allowing himself to form deep connections. But now, with Lyra, things were different. He could see it in her eyes, the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide. He reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "You don't have to be alone anymore," he said softly. Lyra looked at him, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I know," she whispered. "I think I'm starting to believe that." The words hung in the air, a quiet promise between them. It was a small step, but it was a step forward, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could both find something resembling peace. The night grew deeper, and the fire crackled softly in the hearth, the world outside untouched by the warmth that filled the small cabin. Jake and Lyra sat in silence, their thoughts drifting as they both came to terms with the fragile, uncertain bond they had formed. It was a new beginning, one that neither of them could have imagined when their journey first started, but it was enough. For tonight, they were safe, and that was all that mattered. The days in the cabin grew warmer as spring slowly began to take hold of the valley. The winds that had once been sharp and cold were now gentler, and the sun lingered a little longer in the sky. Jake and Lyra had fallen into a rhythm, their days marked by simple tasks: chopping wood, tending to the small garden outside, and gathering food. The cabin, though humble, had become a place of solace and quiet. Jake had learned more about Lyra in these last weeks than he had ever expected. She was intelligent, resourceful, and strong in a way that went beyond her physical strength. Her knowledge of the stars, of far-off worlds, amazed him. Yet, despite her vast knowledge, there was something deeply human about her, something that made her feel less like an alien and more like someone he could trust, someone he could care about. One afternoon, as they worked together to clear some brush near the cabin, Jake noticed a shift in Lyra. She was more relaxed, her movements more fluid, and she seemed to be smiling more often. For the first time since they had met, she seemed truly at peace. Jake couldn't help but notice how different she seemed from the guarded, distant woman he had first encountered on Ember Ridge. "You're looking better," Jake remarked, wiping the sweat from his brow as he paused for a moment. Lyra looked up from the brush she was clearing, offering him a small smile. "I feel better," she replied, her voice warm, almost light. "This place, it's growing on me." Jake felt a strange warmth at her words, a sense of relief that they were both adjusting to this new life. They had made it this far, and somehow, despite the odds, they had found something resembling peace. "It's good to hear that," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "You've been through a lot, Lyra. You deserve a chance to relax." Lyra looked at him for a long moment, her gaze steady. "And you?" she asked softly. "Do you deserve a chance to relax, Jake?" The question caught him off guard, and for a moment, he didn't know how to answer. He wasn't used to thinking about his own needs, his own well-being. It had always been about survival, always about the next step, the next fight. But now, with Lyra, things felt different. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting for something else. He was fighting for her. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice thoughtful. "Maybe, Lyra nodded, as if she understood. They both fell silent, the only sound the rustling of the leaves in the breeze and the distant calls of birds. It was a moment of quiet understanding between them, a shared acknowledgement of their circumstances and what they had been through. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the hills and the cabin grew dim, Jake found himself sitting by the fire with Lyra. She was curled up on the couch, her head resting against the arm, her eyes closed as she listened to the crackling fire. Jake watched her for a moment, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for her presence. They had both survived, and in doing so, had found something far more valuable than just survival. They had found each other. Lyra opened her eyes, catching him staring. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Jake smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I'm just thinking how lucky we are," he said quietly. "I never thought I'd end up here, with you." Lyra returned his smile, her silver eyes shimmering in the firelight. "I never thought I'd end up here either," she said, her tone thoughtful. "But maybe this is where we were meant to be." Jake nodded, the weight of her words settling in his chest. There was still so much uncertainty ahead of them, but in this moment, he realized that it didn't matter. For the first time, they had found something worth fighting for. Together, they would face whatever came next. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he had found something worth holding on to. As the fire flickered and the night grew deeper, Jake and Lyra sat in comfortable silence, the warmth of the cabin and the connection between them the only things that mattered. For the first time since their journey began, everything felt right. And Jake knew, without a doubt, that this was just the beginning of something new, something they would face together. The seasons continued to shift, and with each passing day, the cabin became more than just a place of shelter. It became a home. The small tasks that had once seemed overwhelming now felt like routine, and Jake found comfort in the simplicity of their days together. He and Lyra had grown closer, their bond forged through shared experiences and quiet moments of understanding. They talked more now, about everything and nothing. The quiet tension that had once existed between them had softened, replaced by something more familiar. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, talking about their pasts, their dreams, and the unknown future that lay ahead. Jake had learned about Lyra's home planet, a place far beyond the stars they could see from Earth. She spoke of the lush, vibrant forests and the sparkling rivers that stretched as far as the eye could see. Yet, despite the beauty of her world, it was the loss that defined her story: loss of home, loss of family, and the uncertainty of her place in the universe. Jake listened to her words with a quiet intensity, understanding that while they had both been lost in different ways, they had found a new purpose here, together. But even as their connection grew stronger, Jake knew that they could not stay in this small cabin forever. The world outside still held many unknowns, and sooner or later, the past would catch up with them. It was one evening, as the sun began to set and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, that Jake finally spoke the words he had been avoiding. "Lyra," he began, his voice steady but full of meaning. "We can't stay here forever. We've both got things we need to face, and the world is bigger than this cabin." Lyra looked at him, her silver eyes catching the fading light. She had known this moment was coming. "I know," she replied softly, her voice laced with acceptance. "I've been thinking about it too." Jake hesitated, his thoughts swirling. He had grown to care for Lyra in ways he hadn't expected, and the thought of leaving this quiet life behind filled him with a sense of unease. But he also knew that their journey wasn't over, and there were still many questions they needed answers to. "We need to find out what's out there," he said, his voice firm. "We need to know what happened to you, to understand what's next for us." Lyra nodded, her gaze steady. "I understand," she said quietly. "I've spent so long running, hiding from the truth. Maybe it's time to stop running." The words hung between them, a promise of something yet to come. As the fire flickered and the night deepened around them, Jake realized that despite the uncertainty of the future, they were no longer alone. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The next morning, they began preparing. There was little to gather, just a few belongings and the supplies they had accumulated over the past weeks. Jake packed what he could, making sure they had enough for the journey ahead. Lyra, though quiet, helped without hesitation. She had become stronger in the time they had spent together, more confident in herself and her abilities. As they finished their preparations, Jake felt a surge of determination. They weren't just leaving to escape. They were leaving to find answers, to forge their own path in a world that was still largely unknown to both of them. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready. Together, they would face whatever came next. And with that thought, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. The past was behind them, and the future, uncertain as it was theirs to shape. The morning light broke through the trees, casting a soft glow on the cabin as Jake and Lyra packed the last of their supplies. The small, quiet home they had built together was now a memory, one that would stay with them as they ventured into the unknown. They had come so far since their arrival at Ember Ridge, and now, with their bags packed and their minds set, they were ready for whatever came next. Lyra stood beside him, her silver eyes scanning the horizon. She had grown stronger over the past few weeks, both physically and mentally, but Jake could still see the flicker of uncertainty in her gaze. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice low but steady. She turned to him, her expression calm but thoughtful. "I think so," she replied. "I've spent so much time running from my past, but maybe it's time to face it." Jake nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of their shared journey. He had never imagined his life would take this turn. From the moment he had found Lyra, he had known their paths were intertwined, and now, with the world outside calling them forward, there was no turning back. They shared a quiet moment before stepping outside, the morning air cool but refreshing. The sounds of the forest surrounded them, a reminder of the life they had found in this isolated place. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lifting from his shoulders. They had survived Ember Ridge, and now they had to move on. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure: they would face it together. As they made their way down the path, the trees parted to reveal a vast landscape beyond. The valley stretched out before them, its beauty undeniable. For a moment, Jake felt a sense of awe at the sheer magnitude of the world they were about to enter. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. "Where do we go now?" Lyra asked, breaking the silence between them. Jake paused, looking out over the valley. He had no clear answer, but the uncertainty didn't bother him. "We find the answers," he said, his voice full of conviction. "We find out what happened to you, to your people, and we make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." Lyra nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I trust you, Jake," she said quietly. It was the first time she had said those words, and they meant more to Jake than anything else she could have said. He glanced over at her, his heart swelling with a sense of pride and gratitude. They had come so far, and now they had the chance to rebuild, to discover what lay beyond their small corner of the world. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead. They walked on in silence, the weight of the future pressing down on them, but the promise of a new beginning lifting their spirits. Jake didn't know what the future held, but as long as they were together, he felt ready to take on anything. And, with that thought in his mind, he turned back to Lyra, offering her a small smile. She returned it, and for the first time in what felt like forever, they both felt a sense of peace. Whatever came next, they would face it as a team.